Everybody, and welcome to this very special, I don't know if I'll call it an edition, an Australia at Home event. Today we are paying our respects and looking at the legacy of the life and career of the great Jack Mundey, particularly around his contribution to Sydney through the Green Bands. I'll introduce you our fabulous panel of guests in a moment, but before we get started, would just like to pay respects to the traditional owners on the land on which we are all meeting. Many of us will be on Gadigal land of the Eora people. That is the land that Jack really contributed to maintaining at least some semblance of a heritage. But wherever you are in Australia, I know you'll join me in paying respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise the land we're all on was never ceded. I think we'll have some new faces in today, given the specific discussion we're in. So if you are new, welcome to Australia at Home. We've been running this project right through the lockdown. The aim of this is a place where people can come together and share ideas and support each other. We encourage you to have cameras on. We encourage you to use the chat, introduce yourself, tell people where you're from. And as we go through our discussion, please ask questions, make comments. And as we go through today's discussion, you'll have an opportunity to come up and make your contributions to it as well. And, you know, what a privilege it is to have the opportunity to run today's event. Jack passed away, I think it was in May, aged 90. And so we were right in the lockdown, middle of the lockdown. And I think while there was an obituary in the paper, I don't think any of us had a real chance to reflect. So the idea of today is to draw people's attention to a fantastic exhibition on Jack Mundey's contribution to the Green Bands that's currently on at the Trades Hall in Sydney. And of course, for those of you who aren't in Sydney or can't get there at the moment, to give you a bit of a look at some of the iconic images and really interesting curios that Unions New South Wales's Labor historian and my good friend Neale Towart has pulled together. And so we're going to use this as a catalyst to have a discussion both about the tradition of unionism that Jack created, the contribution to Sydney, and also the legacy. And to join us in those discussions are two people who lived alongside these amazing moments in Sydney and Australians' industrial history. Firstly, Meredith Burgmann. I don't know how to introduce you, Meredith, former union leader, academic, president of the Legislative Council, mad activist, icon, sage, whatever you want to call yourself. Welcome, Meredith, and thanks for being part of today's discussion. And Wendy Bacon, who is a legendary investigative journalist who actually also just disclosed to me that she's part of the club of people that worked as communications officers for unions as well, in fact, for the BLF at one point. So there'll be some great war stories to go there too. So welcome, Wendy, and thanks for being part of today's discussion. I thought I'd kick off just by asking each of the three of you just to tell me how you felt when you and what your reflections were in May when you heard the news of Jack's passing. So maybe first to you, Wendy.
Well, I knew that Jack was very unwell, so I wasn't really, I get shocked to hear that he died. I knew that he was going to die fairly soon. So, of course, you know, just reflecting on his contribution, I think, you know, one of the things at the outset I'd like to say is that Jack was a militant campaigner until his last days. And I think there's a lot to be learned for that. You know, he was organising green bands, you know, even at the Bondi Pavilion, for example, through the current CFMEU till, you know, his very last years. So I see Jack as an amazing environmentalist, but very much, you know, a very warm person. You know, right, I saw Jack down at Sirius Building protests in recent years and always so warm, always really still battling on. And yeah, I think he was, and very much a landmark environmentalist. He was, in that sense, a visionary. And I could say a bit more about that, but he saw from the very beginning the potential for an importance of ecology and environmentalism.
Thanks, Wendy. Yes, I researching this, I remembered that 20 years ago, I actually went out to his house and interviewed him while I was editing Workers Online, which was the old Unions New South Wales workers paper. And I'll send you a link. But the one thing that struck me was he was living in a townhouse in Croydon Park, I think it was, and he made a cup of tea. And I guess because he was such a cultural icon, I was expecting to see somebody that had taken all the trappings of celebrity and public influence. And it was the exact opposite. This was a man who really lived by his values and was seeking nothing more than his impact on the broader society. Neale, I'm interested in, your initial response when you heard the news, and you're a keen history of Labor and why you felt an imperative to put this exhibition together. And while you're doing this, I'm actually going to share the screen and start showing some of the images from the exhibition that you have put together.
Okay, well, I mean, I would also like to acknowledge the land and the Gadigal people whose land we're on. And I would say that I was interested in Jack from a very young age, mainly because of my father. I mean, I was a generation below, so when the Green Bands were on, I was very much a primary school, high school kid. So, but I became aware of them at the time, I suppose, which says something since I was in country New South Wales. So to have that awareness then, it just shows the impact that it was having in a lot of different places. So coming to Sydney in the early 80s, after being in rural New South Wales, finding out more about it, but also and seeing Rocking the Foundations, the film, a little while after that, made me aware of Jack, but I'd never met him until the early 2000s. And I think just acknowledging what Wendy just said, an incredibly warm person who agreed to come and speak at an exhibition that we're having in Springwood. And Jack he agreed on top of a hat. Now, he had no reason to want to come to an exhibition which was put on by the Labor Council of New South Wales, given the history there. But he came along and it was actually on May Day in 2004, I've just rediscovered, and he spoke very powerfully about the state of the world at the time. And sometime after that, he was, through a friend of his, and I think Wendy and Meredith's friend pulled through, he did give us a number of boxes of his own material that he had collected. So he was obviously aware of the need to preserve that stuff, but also aware of all the things that were going on, which he never backed away from anything that they did. He stepped in in prominent roles in ways that would sort of further that agenda right throughout his life. I mean, Janine Kitson from the Teachers Federation got him to go up to the Gardens of Stone National Park in the last year of his life to actually try and establish that as a preservation area to prevent it from being undermined by coal mines. So his death sort of made you think, wow, this is a person who has done so much without stopping for so long. And when I was aware of it, an awful lot of people around say, what's the Green Band? Who's Jack Mundey? So it's great to be able to have the chance to remind
So we've got on screen a little bit of the exhibition that's in the Trades Hall. And for those that aren't in Sydney, it's a beautiful spot that Neale curates with a constant flow of union posters and, occasionally something from the banner room upstairs, which are the old 8-hour-a-day march banners. But I think you're down there, Neale, and we can see a bit of what you put together. What was the catalyst and what was the process in putting this together?
Well, the catalyst was very much Jack's boxes of materials, which were scraps of newspaper cuttings, photos. And so we thought, we have to honour this. Let's do this now. Let's put it together. And instead of an exhibition which would be hung in frames delicately in a gallery or something like that, we said, okay, let's make it so we can roll this up, take it around to as many places as we can as easily as possible. And also to do that by using his words as much as we could from various interviews that he's done over the years. Though his death catalysed us into doing something with it, though we had used aspects of his material before, but to actually put together about Jack rather than about the whole thing, even though all those issues that he was involved in come through. It doesn't pretend to be telling the whole comprehensive story, but to give a snapshot of what they did and I think that snapshot shows why it is still important.
Thanks, Neale. Meredith, I think we've got you back now from the Zoom gremlin. So welcome and thanks for your time. Firstly, how did you feel and what have your been reflections since Jack's passing?
Well, I knew Jack was very ill, so it wasn't a surprise, but it was just a terrible feeling of being bereft. I just felt Jack's really the last of that group of wonderful builders, labourers, both men and women, who did those amazing things, because the rest of the leadership have now died. Most of the rank and filers have died. As Jack always said, if he'd known he was going to live this long, he would have looked after himself better, because on the whole, builders, labourers did not look after themselves. So it was just this terrible feeling of, you know, who do you talk to now? I mean, there's still Pat Fisk, of course, and Wendy and one or two other builders, labourers, but it's a terrible passing of a period. And of course, Jack himself was such a lovely man and such fun to be with. He loved to provoke people. The way he used to provoke me about being in the Labor Party, and of course I'd provoke him back for his various political problems. But and what Peter said about the way he lived, Judy told me the other day that they had lived in that little townhouse in Croydon Park for I think it's 55 years or something. I mean, they never changed, and Jack truly lived the life that he was talking about of sustainability and not spending money. Well, they didn't have any money.
Yeah, look, and I want to, before we talk, Meredith, about the legacy of the parts of Sydney that the Green Band saved, I don't think you can talk about the Green Bands before you talk about the model of unionism and the context of that BLF leadership team. We've got a lovely photo here of Trades Hall before the renovations. I remember that as a very young industrial reporter, but obviously not in the 1960s. Take us back to this period and the project that Jack was part of with the BLF, if you could, Meredith.
Well, one of the reasons why they were able to get their rank and file to be so staunch about issues like the Green Bands and even the pink bands on the LGBT, helping the gay community and things like that, was that Jack and a few others had been very important in wresting the leadership of the builders' labourers away from the very right-wing, semi-corrupt leadership of the 50s and 60s. And that had been a long, hard struggle. But by 1968, the left-wing leadership had broken through. And they immediately put into place democratic processes. The officials were only paid the leading hand builders' labourers rate, which of course, mostly in those days, union officials were paid a lot more than their members. The officials were not paid when there was an industry strike on. Of course, he brought in his most famous change, which was limited tenure of office. But they also made their office itself, Room 33 in Trades Hall, they made that very open to rank and filers to come in and, you know, have a cup of tea and talk about their day. One of their reforms that wasn't so successful was they sold all the union cars and bought the officials motor scooters because, you know, Jack was already on his thing about, you know, sustainability. And but the problem with that was that the officials kept having terrible accidents on the motor scooters. So they eventually went back to the cars. But the officials didn't wear suits. They used to go down to the commission in their working clothes. Another one of their very important innovations was that they had translators at all their general meetings. And of course, because it was such a diverse workforce, it made the general meetings very, very boring because there'd be sometimes 7 or 8 translations going on for each motion. But of course, it was very important in making certain that their immigrant workforce was kept up to date and very devoted to them, in fact.
We've got a press clip from that moment, actually, Meredith, just up at the moment. I might just bring Wendy in. How did the media regard this group? Was it like, I could imagine a group like this taking over a union now and how the Daily Telegraph would cover it. Were they regarded as freaks? Were they regarded as revolutionaries? Like how were these people seen?
They were regarded not that differently, actually, originally anyway, in the late 60s and early 70s than they would be today. And I think that's important for people to understand that they weren't, like today we tend to see the New South Wales Builders, Labourers and Jack and the Green Bands as, you know, a heroic moment, and people are very positive about it. But actually I went recently, because I was doing an article about Kelly's Bush actually, and I went back through a lot of media coverage, and, you know, they were horrified. Like there was one photo, I think it was in the Herald, I'm not sure, but a group of Builders, Labourers, they were in court for something, and just the whole group went in there and then sort of stormed out into the streets, and they did take over at least 2 building sites that I know of for periods, and actually run them under workers' control principles. So this was very threatening. Now, I would say that in a way, the alliances that came about through the Green Bands, and particularly various younger, and Carolyn Jones was another journalist at the time, really did get on board with the idea of the Green Bands, and the media treatment was certainly mixed and more favourable, but they, you know, the idea of militant unionism was as threatening then. The builders, the master builders hated them. At one stage we occupied the master builders' offices. Yeah, no, they were regarded as a dangerous threat, no doubt about that.
And in fact, the Sydney Morning Herald had 5 editorials in 12 days calling for Jack, Joe and Bob to be jailed. And of course, the Herald has totally rewritten history and now talks as if it actually supported the Green Bands. But yeah, none of the mainstream media supported the Builders Labourers at all.
I think that's really important. And I think also I found it interesting, and I really liked the exhibition and the way it did situate the Green Bands, as Meredith does in her book too, but situate the Green Bands in terms of union struggles, as you have today too, Peter. And I think that the idea that you know, workers could have some sort of say, the really hard-won battles for safety, all of that, you know, really laid the groundwork. But it built also on the campaigns about penalty clauses and the whole Clary O'Shea moment when he was jailed, and that was in Melbourne. But you know, the sort of, it wasn't that it was easy to be a unionist then; it was also very hard.
The other bit that I think I struggle to appreciate, I'm sure anyone younger that's part of this call would struggle, we're still in the Cold War. We know that in Australia there was real Cold War battles fought within the unions, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the BLF was CPA, like they were a Communist Party aligned leadership team, and that just seems so far out of people's conception now that I don't even know if it just feels like a weird thing to say. But what was that sense that this was part of a broader geopolitical battle, and how did that sense of alignment with the CPA or the Communist Party sort of play out at that point, like late 60s, early 70s?
The main problem for the Builders Labourers and their Communist Party connections happened within the building industry. The leadership was, it was mainly communist, but they had a very, very good relationship with the left of the Labor Party. Many of their officials were in fact left Labor, like Bob Pringle and Kevin Cook and Bud Cook. They were left Labor, whereas Joe Owens and Jack Mundey and Tom Hogan were the Communist Party. So they were seen as a communist-led union. And in a sense that their main problem was that the Communist Party itself was divided, and that division was mostly played out within the building industry. You had Norm Gallagher down in Melbourne, who headed the Maoists, the CPAML. You had in New South Wales, you had the head of the Tradesmen's Union, the BWIU, Pat Clancy, and he headed the Stalinists. So after the split in the Communist Party, the first split in 1961, which was with the Maoists, And the second split in 1968, you get this real tension within the building industry of who's going to have the power. And I have always said that, yes, the New South Wales Builders Labourers, who by this stage were the independent sort of Aaron's line Communist Party, that they were destroyed by a combination of Norm Gallagher and the Maoists and the Tradesmen's Union, the BWIU and the Stalinists, because if the tradesmen had protected BLF work during federal intervention, Jack and Joe and Bob could possibly have survived. So it was, their communism actually was more of a problem within the union than outside.
And of course, maybe for, it's important to point out that actually it wasn't that unusual for a union to be communist controlled at that stage. I mean, there were, you know, of course, there was the waterside workers. They were more, they were actually SPA, whereas Meredith explained, during that period. And there was some very, I think one of the things about the Green Band period is it really opened up a lot of those tensions. And there was a night that I will never forget when a seaman called Mick Fowler came back to Victoria Street, where there was an attempt to evict everyone and a big development was going ahead there. And Mick was a tenant there, and he came back from sea and he saw all his belongings on the pavement and he'd been evicted. And you know, he was very solidly as a seaman with the SPA, with the Socialist Party of Australia, which had split from the CPA. And of course, that was quite a big deal. Was he going to be protected by the Green Band? Was he going to move back in? And he sat all night in a building called the Stables with his head in his hands, as only Mick Fowler could do. And in the morning, he sort of got up and said, I'm with the Green Bands. And various, there were those tensions, but people tended to come together during those days. Although Meredith is also right, the BWIU, I mean, those big splits were very important, but at a grassroots level, it all began to dissolve. And I thought I would also mention, because there are some, sadly, very few old organisers still alive, but I noticed one of them in a photo that we've got in the exhibition, I think people are going to see, of the Rocks. And there's a photo there with Joe, I think, and Bobby Pringle of Dean Barber. Dean Barber would to this day describe himself as an anarcho-syndicalist. And there were amongst the organisers, and I think this indicates the breadth of the politics and the different strands, but there were a couple of organisers who were dead set anarchist, organised style of anarchism, and that was certainly an influence in the squatters movement as well.
Can I say,
you want to say something? And just as you talk, I'll go through a few because I want to get into the Green Band. So we're just going through the White Australia and the Opera House as you speak, Neale.
And to add to what Wendy was saying, we have to remember that the rest of the union movement didn't support the builders' labourers. The rank and files often did, but the leaderships did not. At the final meeting of the builders' labourers, only two unions were there in support, and that was the FEDFA, which was a little union within the building industry, which had been very solid all the way through and always supported the Green Bands. And the other union was the Teachers' Federation, but none of the other unions were there. And it wasn't until Joe Owen's funeral, 10 years ago, that the then Secretary of Labor Council, Mark Lennon, actually apologised to the builders' labourers on behalf of New South Wales Labor Council for the fact that they had been so unsupportive of them. And it was a hugely important thing to happen for the old builders' labourers who were there.
Hey, Neale.
Yeah, well, I think I would just sort of backing up what both Wendy and Meredith have said about the Communist Party, in that, you know, the CPA, as it was, the leadership was maybe the Aarons's were famously in charge, and they did split from the Moscow line and that sort of thing. But I think also the way that the BLF, the rank and file movement, which was the BLF from when they took over in the 60s was very much linked into that anarcho-syndicalist outlook that Wendy's talking about. The way that they acted on sites as the rank and file without the sort of official imprimatur of the union office was something the Communist Party itself, any of those three communist parties, had terrible trouble dealing with, including the more progressive section, which the CPA represented. And their support for the BLs was also, I think, could be criticised in that sense, in that they couldn't quite keep up with what was happening on the ground as well. Not that would have necessarily meant that the whole thing survived, but it certainly would have given a bit stronger backing but because of the way that sort of syndicalist approach didn't quite fit in with the CPA's whole approach to what they saw their role as.
So we could do a whole hour on the ins and outs of the industrial left in the early 70s, but let's get into the green bands. Kelly's Bush was the first one, which was, the telling I've heard is it was a bunch of very nice upper middle class ladies in Hunters Hill who formed an alliance with these hairy back builders labourers to save their suburb. Is that a simplification there, Wendy, or is that the basic gist of it?
It's a really gross simplification, I think, although it's very much the one that I think was the key message. Look, there's no doubt that Hunters Hill was a middle-class suburb, and there's no doubt that most of the Kelly's Bush battlers were women who didn't work from middle-class backgrounds. But last year, for a newspaper that came out through the Art Gallery of New South Wales, I really went into who those women were who stepped up at Kelly's Bush. And it turns out that one of them, the secretary, her name was Lahane, actually came from quite a radical and progressive background and had been involved in the peace movement. And then I found that one of them, in fact, was a very well-qualified leading obstetrician. And so it's always more complicated. And they absolutely were people of their time who seized an opportunity to organise. And I found, too, in researching it, that and these days, I think people would be shocked in some ways, other than if the climate strikes hadn't come along. But the students at Hunters Hill schools marched out one afternoon and right down the street. And it used to happen back then, quite frequently, actually, these sort of on the street sudden demonstrations. And so, there was, and also the left of the Labor Party were on side in Hunters Hill as well, Rob Cavalier and others. So it is a bit of a caricature, but I guess the key point is there that it was a middle class alignment with, for them to back and take on board the support of a union was a big step. And but there's a little anecdote I'll tell, and then I'll let someone else speak. But one of the women did say, wrote it down in her anecdote of the events, that she said to her husband, I don't think that I could be involved because this is a red union. And he said, absolutely, we are going to be involved. And while that may say something about the relationship, but it also just says to us that when people's interests are involved and when they can really see the benefits, they can make very big shifts, I think, in what they're prepared to support. And it was interesting me also when I was researching Juanita Nilsson to see that she went from Victoria Street over to Kelly's Bush, not long before she died, and said, I will be there in front of the bulldozers. So there was a mood that swept up a lot of people at that time.
And I'd like to add that the Kelly's Bush Green Band, which of course it's 50 years next year in August, and it might seem a hugely important thing now, but at the time it seemed quite insignificant. If you read the Builders Labourers Minutes, it just says that Brother Pringle reported that he and the FEDFA organiser had gone out to Kelly Bush, sick, and that he recommended that there be a ban put on further development there. There was no, trumpeting that this is a new environmental ban. The executive decided to support it, but they did send someone out to check. And it wasn't, in fact, people think that that Kelly's Bush became a green band straight away. In fact, the term green band isn't even used for another 2 years. It's first used in 1973. So
with the rocks or elsewhere? Because now I'm just bringing up a photo of a very young and funky looking Meredith Burgmann behind Jack Mundey there.
Oh, thank you.
That is an amazing, that's an amazing suit.
I know. I wish you could see it. I wish you could see it in colour.
My daughter just bought one, very like that, actually.
It was actually yellow, orange and turquoise. It was fabulous. I must have come straight from work, because you'd never wear your good clothes to a demonstration, especially one of these where you were likely to be dragged through the rubble. Yes.
So what's going on there in this photo, Meredith, and where are we?
That's at Playfair Street in the Rocks. And as you can see, a lot of
I don't think it's a totally successful green band by the look of that building.
Well, it was an old warehouse that had been partially destroyed. I don't think it was particularly historic, but what was happening was, as you can see, a lot of the people behind us are actually residents, but they're also residents from other areas. There's Nellie Leonard from Woolloomooloo, there's Peter Wright from Glebe, there's John Cox from up in Darlinghurst, John Clare. People from all over Sydney had come and said, this far and no further. It was to stop the demolitions further down in Playfair Street, and it was successful. It was, the point about the Rocks is that that's the green band that everyone remembers, but in actual fact they also saved the whole of Glebe and the whole of Woolloomooloo, and those green bands keep being forgotten because the Rocks one was so spectacular.
Yes, Jim Donovan and the retired Maritime Union crew came in yesterday for a look around, and we have got this photo, of course, here. And Jim said, because I only know there's Jack and Meredith in the photo, and Jim said, well, look, there's me there. So he's with Nellie Leonard and the Woolloomooloo residents group in there to your left.
Oh yeah, right down the left, yeah.
Yeah.
Classic. So one other war story, Meredith, that is a little bit linked to your place in history. So it wasn't just the green bands at the time. It was anti-apartheid. This headline says Union official charged after cutting an SCG goalpost. You went one better and stole the football in the middle of a test match, didn't you?
No, it was my sister Wendy Bacon who.
Oh, that was Verity. Sorry.
Grabbed the football and kicked it, and the Bulletin called it the best kick of the season because it just went up in the air. I lay down in the middle of the scrum because I couldn't think of anything else to do.
So just bring us back there for the younger people, particularly my staff who don't. So there was a rugby, this was before the apartheid boycotts. South Africa came to Australia and you decided that the game shouldn't go on uninterrupted.
Yes, we've been running the Stop the Tours campaign for a couple of years, and we've been demonstrating against other racially selected all-white sporting tours from South Africa. And this one was, of course, the Springboks. And we were also trying to stop the cricket tour that was going to come 6 months later. And we succeeded in that. That was successful. But getting back to what Bob did, Bob Pringle, who was the president of the union, part of the Labor left grouping within the union, he and his great mate from the ironworkers, Johnny Phillips, decided that they would cut down the goalposts, and then they decided, no, we'll actually just saw halfway through them so that they actually fall down in the middle of the game. So that was their actual plot. But they did get caught. It became quite a big case. In fact, I think Jack Mundey got charged with contempt of court for having said something mean about the judge in the case. Anyway, this case went on for ages, and it was a very funny case, as you can imagine, and it just showed what terrific people the leadership were.
Lateral thinking and great viral campaigning. It would have been a great meme if it was today, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Look, sorry, now go on.
Sorry, I think the story goes, Bob, they were sawing down the post and the police in the stands who were supposedly guarding the thing, but they'd actually fallen asleep in the stands. So they managed to get most of the job done. But apparently they woke up the police because the cutting tools got a bit hot and noisy after a while. So.
We'd normally come up for air and go to questions from the room, but I think this is so great going through that unless anyone particularly wants to ask a question at this stage, we might leave that till the end and keep going through this great prezzo of Neale's. The next one is actually a poster for one of several movies. I'd never seen Woolloomooloo, but I have seen Rocking the Foundations. And Pat Fisk seems to be the name that is the director for both these. Do you have much context of this, Wendy?
Well, this film was made actually before Rocking the Foundations, and recently I watched it again, and I'd like to say to everybody who's here with us that this film is really worth watching. It's one of the most analytical films I think I've ever seen. It's fairly long, but it really pulls apart the whole role of the property industry, which is still so important in terms of today and corruption in Sydney. And it also shows the sort of grassroots movement in the Woolloomooloo. It shows the People's Plan, which was very significant. It was been a big room with a big table and people moving around things that actually were people planning. And yeah, I think it's a terrific film. The other people are Peter Gailey, who was and also Denise White. So it was a three-part film. And in fact, some of it was based on just little Super 8 movies that were made in Victoria Street during the squatting and down in Woolloomooloo. So it's not as well known as Rocking the Foundations, but I really recommend it. And another thing I would say is that the posters really stand up today. And I think, again, Neale has done a terrific job of getting them up there. And, you know, they were done by a whole range of people, including Tony Robertson, who I've got one of her posters about the nuclear campaign behind me today. And, yeah, that's basically what I would say about that. So there was a huge ongoing struggle in Woolloomooloo, and this film really gets the bigger picture with that.
Can I just say about Woolloomooloo and the green band there, that it brings up the issue of how did those big green bands like Glebe, Woolloomooloo and the Rocks succeed? And really they needed to have a sympathetic Labor government come into office and help out. And Jack Mundey always made that very clear. He used to say, sometimes we had a green ban on as a holding operation until there could be a political solution. And for instance, in Glebe, Tom Uren becomes the Minister for Urban Development in 1972, and he organises for the federal government to buy the Glebe and save it from the two big expressways that they're going to go through. Woolloomooloo is the same. You have to wait until a Labor government gets in and makes that into housing department. The same with the Rocks. And this isn't a thing about Labor governments, but obviously Conservative governments were never going to do it. So, and Jack himself had a very good relationship with Neville Wran, for instance, and the building of the Sirius, the one that's going, is unfortunately probably going to be pulled down now, which was purpose built as housing department housing for workers to live in the inner city. That was really an arrangement between Jack Mundey and Neville Wran that would happen. And often you come to see these things and find out about these things many years later, because at the time I wasn't aware of that being what it was.
So the photo we've got up now is about, sorry, go Wendy.
I just want the photo that we've got on the screen now. Could I say something about that?
Yes, I was going to throw to you for that very reason.
So I mentioned before Mick Fowler sitting in the corner angsting about could he go with a green band when he was in the Seamen's Union that did not support the green bands. So this is Mick in his room in Victoria Street. At the time this poster was put out, I think we probably had 100 squatters along the street in various houses. At the end of it all, Mick was the only one. All the rest were evicted. But one message on this poster that I wanted to emphasise was it wasn't just about saving the buildings. It was very much about saving the inner city. In the case of the green bands that were like Woolloomooloo, the Rocks, it was to save it for low-income people. And that's why it's so tragic, really, that what's happened in the Rocks is ultimately the coalition government has allowed all that housing to be sold off, and really is against the spirit of saving it. But Mick was a musician as well as a seaman, and you can see, I think, his banjo there, and his whole wall was covered with various forms of small pictures. He lived in a little room. I actually squatted in that building myself and probably had the best housing I'd ever had at that stage. And just another little memory of that is that people who were in the Communist Party, like Hal Alexander, who was an electrician who only died several years ago, they came and connected the whole street. The plumbing was fixed, the electricity was going, we had phones, and all of that was done by people just prepared to volunteer their labour and put forward their skills.
So the photo there of Juanita Nielsen, it's an iconic photo.
Yes.
It's one of the great unexplained crimes of Sydney. How does her story fit into the Green Band story?
Well, it fits in very much because she was, again, a person who would never usually have supported anything like a green band, but she was transformed. I mean, I think it's important that people can be transformed by these sorts of events. And so in the beginning, like, she wasn't too keen on the Victoria Street Action Group because we were pretty radical. She was really like the Woolloomooloo Resident Action Group, who we also got on well with, but they were more traditional working class people. But gradually her newspaper, and she was a serious journalist in this way, changed from being a sort of business type outlet for King's Cross into basically an outlet for the green bands. So one of her last ones had whole pages on Kelly's Bush, she had whole pages on Woolloomooloo. And then she also was absolutely getting behind the green band to stay on Victoria Street. So she was a threat. She was definitely a threat and was, I guess, the only journalist in Australia that I know of who was literally disappeared. It's not something that happens, is unusual in some other countries, but she's a disappeared journalist. Did
you have much to do with her? Yeah, sorry, Neale. Then I'll go to Meredith.
Sorry, I just want to note, a few people are asking, I know that the film Woolloomooloo, Pat Fisk, we're lucky to have it again, the sort of saving these things. Pat told me some years ago that it was waiting at the National Film and Sound Archive to be restored and digitised, but I think it has been done, but it took some time, so it could easily have been lost. And the paper now, Juanita's paper, luckily for us, again, the Woolloomooloo Residents Action Group some years ago rang us up just out of the blue here at Trades Hall and said, "Are you from the CFMEU?" And we'd say, "No." "Are you from the Labor Party?" "No." No. He said, "Good, come down here. We've got all this stuff we just rescued from being thrown out, and it's all about the Woolloomooloo Residents Action Group." So we hot-footed it down there. So there were boxes of now and a whole lot of minutes from the Residents Action Group meetings and all that sort of stuff. So yes, as Wendy said, the paper is full of classic, let's go to the bourbon and beefsteak and all the bars and everything, but also it just gradually changes into lots of other stuff as well.
And Meredith, your reflections on the Woolloomooloo battles?
Well, I also was involved with Victoria Street and ended up getting arrested at one stage. And
several stages, I think, wasn't it?
Sorry?
Several stages. You got arrested?
I only got arrested twice during the green bands. But the Victoria Street one was very funny because I was sitting in court and the policeman who had arrested me came up and said, "Oh, you actually taught me at Macquarie University. It's all right, we're letting you all off." In actual fact, I think they'd mucked up their paperwork somehow because all of us were let off. And but he wanted me to know that I had taught him. So I think he thought he was doing me a favour. I admired the people who did squat there for long periods. I only ever spent a few nights there. It was pretty basic. And the place I was in, the old Hashfield Hotel, didn't have hot water at the time. So I wasn't particularly keen on it. But places like Woolloomooloo, the Rocks and Glebe, those very, very close inner city suburbs, simply wouldn't have remained the streetscapes they are now if it hadn't been for the builders' labourers. That's why when we brought out the second edition or the second edition of our book, it was reprinted 20 years after we first wrote it, and we changed the title. It's now called, actually I'll put it up here, Green Band's Red Union, The Saving of a City, which is the new part of the title. Because
so we'll have to put a link to that in the chat. There's also Jim Coleman's book that Jim might come on at the end if we've got time, which is a fantastic telling of these tales. I feel like we've got a few more slides, but we might just whiz then come up for a bit of discussion with our lovely audience who have been really active in the chat. I'm really keen, particularly to bring Don and Jill up, who are reflecting on transformation and the way that politics can change people, which I think is a fantastic sort of discussion point. You mentioned, Meredith, the role of the FEDFA. There's a Christmas card that's part of the exhibition that shows all the different areas and the expansive view of what a union was. There's some more little, you can talk us through these ones, Neale. These are just flyers from various events, are they?
Well, no, the tree poster is sort of iconic poster, which Margaret Grafton, a well-known artist, produced. I think Meredith knows all about it, but I think she was there when they were making it, and especially the addition of the Anne Fedfo, which is written there. But I think the imagery is fantastic. Again, it's a representation of everything that they were involved in at the time. But Meredith knows how the Anne Fedfo has been added, I think.
Well, of course it had to be, because all the bands were supported by the FEDFA. It was a very small union. The guys used to be the crane drivers and backhoe drivers and things like that.
Yeah, but I think didn't you have to sit there the night before and actually hand write all that? Yes.
So there's a few photos of protests. The one I wanted to ask. So Neale, the Birmingham Post Office 76, this is when the Green Bands went global?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that the brief story is that Birmingham Post, they were trying to knock down that post office from about 1972. But a local committee, Victoria Square Committee as it was called, was opposing them, and luckily the whole process was slowed down. And then Jack, after he'd lost, he couldn't get any work in Australia anymore, really. And so, as he says, he actually had to keep himself alive and duty alive by going, being paid for speaking tours and things like that. So he went to Birmingham and spoke about what they'd been doing here. And the UCAT, the Construction and Technical Trades Union there, invited him to speak. And the Green Band Committee was formed then and fought. And the whole thing took 6 years, but they did save that post office. And perhaps more importantly, they came up with a plan for what should happen on the site, which did allow some demolition of one section, but a whole people's plan essentially was put into place in Birmingham after the Green Band had held out for 6 years.
And as Wendy said, Jack continued to be an activist on many levels. He ended up, I think, joining the Green Party. And that's, I think, another interesting sort of landing point at the end of this journey of the BLF, both Meredith and Wendy, that, there was a bridge between environmentalism and the labour movement that seems to still exist, but institutionally now be separated by those two political parties. And I'm interested in your thoughts, particularly Meredith, on that, the fact that Jack ends up being a Greens member, and I think he stood for the CPA in 78, didn't he? Yeah.
He was in the Greens till the end of his life.
I think it was interesting what the old officials did. Some of them went off and joined the Greens, including Jack. Some of them became quite active in the Labor Party. Joe Owens, for instance, was ringing me up daily, giving me instructions on what the Labor Party should be doing. He and Bob Pringle, of course, had always been Labor. I don't think, do you know what? There was very little sectarianism in that leadership. They never seemed to argue between the Labor Party and the Communist Party. They liked the fact that they looked like a bit of a broad-based leadership. And they never really, as I say, it was really the splits within the Communist Party that were a problem for the builders' labourers. So what's happened now with the Labor Party, the left of the Labor Party and the Greens, really I've never really I used to talk to Jack quite a bit about it, but, you know, Jack always had this view that good people should come together and share their beliefs irrelevant of party. And, you know, I agree with that too. You know, I work perfectly well with some Greens.
Of course, the other, I think, reflection that Jack had after his career in the movement was the sense he was critical. He was hugely critical of the Accord years. If I go back over that interview I did with him, and I suspect he would see parts of his model of unionism in the organising that unions do, but then also be less comfortable with the institutional power within the party. What sort of union would Jack run today, do you think, Wendy?
I think I could say that I think that Jack found some bureaucratic aspects of the Communist Party frustrating even back then. On the other hand, he got a huge support from people like Mick Tubbs, who was not in the Builders Labourers, but was sort of a representative of the Communist Party, if you like, often in the office. But I think Meredith's right. He was not a sectarian person. Like, for example, Meredith was in the Labor Party. He remained a very close friend of Meredith's. But his commitment, he did have a very serious commitment to the Greens. I wanted to mention too that Jack, after all, was elected to the City of Sydney Council. He served a term on the council. And I came across newsletters that he actually produced his own newsletter for the Rocks. So there's that period. But he was, along with Judy, active in the Greens. He, for example, would hand out in Croydon regularly at elections. He and Judy would both be there, I'm told, and he stood for the Greens as well. But when I was going through some old material on researching, I came across Jack actually was very familiar with electoral politics way back in probably, I think this would be in the 1960s. He stood for the Communist Party in Vaucluse. Now that was sort
high
of
degree of difficulty. Yeah.
If you were in the Communist Party, you had to be prepared to do that. And I don't think that would have been easy for him. He would have been there handing out, and I think he got about 10 votes.
Well, I saw that when he stood for the New South Wales Parliament in 78, he got 3% of the vote, which at the time was more than the Democrats that were an active force at that stage.
And I think he did quite well in one of the other elections he stood for too. I mean, there was a hope. There was a genuine hope that Jack would get elected because he was so well known and so popular. So more than most other radical people, he had a chance.
Now, we've got some great questions and comments. I just want to throw one thing at you, and I'd normally bring Tim up, but this is just a terrific question. How do people involved in the Green Bands feel about the contemporary political assumption that tradies in construction and mining have fundamentally opposed interest to inner city environmentalists? Thanks for that question, Tim.
Well, I don't know if anyone else would like to say anything. I think it is to some extent, well, it's a pretty big and complicated question. I could say around sort of the big West Connect struggle, which is something I've been involved in, that in Sydney, is that the inner city suburbs are seen by lots of people now as middle class. They're not entirely middle class, but there is that feeling about it, that the middle class people are protecting their nice suburbs. But the tradies, of course, are many of them are not unionised. Many of them are, in fact, anti-union. Even major road construction sites have many contractors on them that are not in the union. That's not to say that the unions aren't there at all. The ETU and the CFMEU are. So, and look, I have to say it's a pretty complicated question. There's no doubt that many tradies see their class interests and their economic interests as being on the right, not the left. And I think, of course, the media really play on this whole idea that the inner suburbs are these very elitist, coffee sipping, and in fact, a lot of that is just an illusion. In fact, most of the people involved in these campaigns are quite left-wing, actually. So, you know, again, you've got media politics involved with it. I think it's perhaps not the best answer.
Meredith, could you have green bans today, or are the laws now so repressive that you just it wouldn't be possible?
I'm often asked that about green bans, and there is a distinction between what are now called green bans and what happened in the 70s. Certainly the legislation, ever since secondary boycotts legislation, that's very damaging for any sort of action about an issue that isn't directly wages and conditions. But also the way in which officials can be fined for taking certain actions. It's made it very difficult to actually put a ban on. And also the problem is that we now have legislation that protects, say, historic buildings. In 1971, there was no legislation that protected anything. We had to wait until 1978 before we got the Environment Protection Act and the Heritage Act. And so what was happening in the early 70s was so stark. Beautiful old buildings were just being pulled down. That doesn't happen now. So they're less stark situations, and you have to be slightly more nuanced about how you run a green ban campaign. I'm not sure that the unions of today, the building unions, have enough credit with their own rank and file to be able to carry out the sort of green ban activity.
Although Peter Murphy's making the point here that we've got Sirius, Willow Grove and Bondi. And hi, exactly. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Yes, so both in the case of Willow Grove and Bondi, I think Meredith's right, but these green bans, say the one at Bondi is built on, again, a successful campaign where you've got the council and the residents working together, and then with Jack, the CFMEU came on board there. Willow Grove is more interesting, but you can see the government adjusting this. Just for those who don't know, Willow Grove is a beautiful building out in the heart of Parramatta, which is at the moment getting destroyed by the New South Wales government. The whole heritage precinct of Parramatta is being very badly impacted. So the builders labourers, Jack was involved out at North Parramatta. More recently, I think it's Darren Greenfield, CFMEU, have got a green ban on Willow Grove. I think something like 3,000 people have signed up to protect that green ban. And now I notice that the government is saying that rather than pull down the building, they want to move the building. And a lot of people are opposed to that too. So that's a very interesting struggle to watch, I think. And if people who are listening in other states are interested, I can add some material maybe later somewhere about that.
So at the end of these, we normally send out an email with some links. So we're going to send out links to the various films we've mentioned, to Jim's book, to Meredith's book, and to anything you want to add, Wendy, because I think, you know, in an hour, it's always hard to get a full picture. And I'm really sorry to the people that put some fantastic comments in the chat. But, you know, we try to keep these to 60 minutes and let people get on with their day. Before we go, Neale, how long's the exhibition there? And if you're in Sydney, what are the sort of social distancing things that people need to book to come along and have a look, or how's it working down there?
Not during the day. Usually we're open 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. The building's open, so it's easy to just walk in. There'll be a few events planned, including there's one on the 4th of November, but again, 40 people for events, which limits it somewhat. We'll be here till at least the 30th of November, though, and then there'll be a few other locations around Sydney, and we're sort of planning a whole trip around New South Wales for the next 12 months, actually, which is well underway, which is great. Hope people will be able to see this in lots of places.
Great, mate. And look, thanks for your ongoing contribution. Like, we need Labor history because, you know, when my kids are coming through and they say, what's a union? If we don't have these stories, and the green bans are one of those great stories that actually brings a whole bunch of ideas like power, like interrupting what seems like it's inevitable, and it brings it all to life. Meredith and Wendy, thank you both for your long-term contributions to making Sydney a better place and, you know, the progressive political movement. And thanks for everyone that's joined us today. This has been a really great discussion, and there'll be a recording of this that's sent out with the email at the end if you want to share it to any comrades who didn't make it today. To our normal community, we'll have a couple of events next week we're emailing you about. We're running a consultation on energy on Thursday, where you get to actually have a say in the way that energy policy is being developed in New South Wales. And then we'll be talking technology on Friday. The following week, we'll be running a number of events around the US elections. And then Friday week, we've got Helen Garner with the Guardian Book Club. So a lot of really great stuff coming up. Thanks for being part of today's discussion, though, everybody.
Can I say,
sorry.
Can I say really thanks to Meredith and Wendy for agreeing to this, and Meredith for all the help you gave us setting this all up.
Yeah, I don't know how you do a round of applause on Zoom where everyone just puts their thumbs up or goes, thanks a lot. But that's been a great discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.